So as I said yesterday, my wife and I, we have a 2.5-year-old daughter, Ellie, and a little son, the remix, Brian 2.0. Brian 2S, he's the improvement. But one thing I love about little kids is their honesty. You know what I mean? Even if their mouths are lying, their bodies are always telling the truth. Their hips don't lie. That's why Shakira would never make a good toddler's name. So my daughter, speaking of honest hips, my daughter, she's not quite potty trained, but she like knows what she's doing and when she's doing it and when she's gonna do it. And but she does this funny thing now that when she poops, like it's pretty obvious. You know, there's like a noticeable shape in her pants, right? And there's also a new walk. You know, she's like normally running everywhere and comfortable sitting down, and then all of a sudden it's like, hey, it's like balancing something, right? And then you're like, oh, why don't you sit down, honey? And she's like, And you're like, did you poop? And she's like, just sit down, And she's like waddling around like, must not let it fall. But it's just so funny how their honesty, and this is why, I don't know if you realize, this is why if your parents think you're lying, they'll keep asking you, because eventually, even if your mouth is consistent, usually your body gives it away. So here's a pretty funny clip from Jimmy Kimmel about a lie detector in kids.
I believe that good sportsmanship and honesty are more important than just about anything when it comes to sports. So I took it upon myself to share that lesson with the next generation of professional athletes, kids, by hooking them up to a fake lie detector and driving them crazy. And here's how that went. Well, hello. How are you?
Good.
Good. Thank you for coming. I'm Officer Jimmy. This is the Truth Fairy. The Truth Fairy is going to hook you up to a machine right now. Do you know what a lie detector is?
Yeah.
A lie detector is a machine that can tell if you're lying or telling the truth. So you must always tell the truth, okay?
Okay.
All right. And then we're going to put this on your head, and we'll be all ready to go.
Wow.
That's right. He's got more gel than you, Truth
Yeah.
Fairy.
Yeah.
Do you gel your hair?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Let's start with your name. What is your name?
Blake,
Okay, very good. How old are you, Blake?
7 years old.
7 years old. What grade are you in?
First grade.
Do you like school?
Yeah.
Do you like school?
No.
No. Why don't you like it?
I'm bad at science.
You bad at science?
Yeah.
You don't like science?
No.
It's boring.
Yeah.
What courses do you like?
Math.
You like math?
Yeah.
Okay. What's 8 plus 8?
16.
14. Have you ever peed in the swimming pool? A little bit? Hold on, let me ask the Truth Fairy. Truth Fairy, have you ever peed in the swimming pool?
Yes.
You? Yes, yeah. I think we all have. It's fun.
It's great.
Sometimes I stand up on the side and pee into the swimming pool.
It's a lot of fun.
What do you like better, your mother or a puppy?
My mother.
Your mother? Why?
Because she takes care of me.
And puppies don't.
No.
Puppies only care about themselves.
Yeah.
Puppies are very selfish.
Yeah.
Do you hate puppies?
No.
Do you hate puppies?
Yeah.
Do you feel like I could get you to say anything with this machine?
No. Yes.
Yes. Who do you think is smarter, your mom or dad?
Dad.
Dad? Why is Dad smarter?
He knows way more history.
He knows more history. Does your mom ever do dumb things?
No.
Does mom ever do dumb things?
Yes.
She does. What kinds of dumb things does she do?
She says bad words.
Oh, she says bad words. Like the really bad words?
Yeah.
Whoa. Do you ever say bad words?
No.
Sometimes?
A little bit.
A little bit with your friends.
We can cut that. So, it's pretty good. All of you with younger siblings are like, I do have something to do next week. But it's kind of cute when it's a kid. But as you get older, to be busted, like the consequences escalate. Like to really get caught, to be busted, and now it's a scary thing to live in the age of everything being documented, right? Every photo being taken, everything being tweeted. Like, have you ever just been busted? Like, caught, no way to hide it in a public way? I mean, I think it's a great fear. I think it's a normal fear that a lot of people have, to be caught in the act, whatever the act is, to just be busted. And it's kind of cute when a little kid is busted because it's really not that big of a deal to begin with. But as people get older, the consequences escalate. In a second, I'm going to show you a short vine. This is from a college football playoff game, and we don't know the details, but you can kind of imagine that this girl is at a game next to a guy who's not her boyfriend, and she is a little bit affectionate, really just a little bit affectionate, don't get too excited, and she's a little bit affectionate, and then she realizes she's on the Jumbotron, and you can see. Let's see that vine.
You're part of that rugby style kicking that comes back and gets you that ball. You want it to spin back if you're kicking.
You see that? She's like rubbing his back, and then all of a sudden she looks up and she's on national television, and she's busted, right? And again, it wasn't like anything crazy, but it's just kind of this sense and this fear that we would all have of, what if I got caught? What if I got busted? And maybe you've never been busted and you're one of the lucky ones. I remember in high school, it seemed to me there were two categories of friends. The ones that always got caught doing anything, and the ones that got away with everything. But the ones that got away with stuff were in fear that I would be busted. And that's like a normal thing. That's just a part of our experience. From the beginning, God creates Adam and Eve. We talked about this a little bit last night, and God said, don't eat the fruit. And Adam and Eve eat the fruit. And it's interesting, the first thing they do is the same thing we do when we're busted, is they try to hide. But they don't just try to hide from God. They put clothes on themselves. It's interesting, they're the only humans in the world. There's no one else to compare themselves to. And they feel like, I gotta hide because there's something wrong with me. There's this shame, and then they hide from God, which is kind of ridiculous, I wonder where they went. Like, they can't hide near the other people. There's like only two humans walking around. Also, he's God. That's kind of, not the best person to hide from. But it's crazy that they're busted and they feel like they need to hide from God, because just before they sin, God is someone that they run to. And all of a sudden, now they feel like they have to run from him. Because they realize something is wrong. That with that first sin, they're busted and shame enters in. And not just do they feel bad about what they did to their relationship with God, but they feel bad about themselves. Eve feels like she has to cover up because who she is shameful. And Adam feels like he has to cover up because he thinks that who he is shameful. And sin escalates. It starts out with Adam and Eve taking fruit. One generation later, there's a brother killing another brother. Fast forward a couple chapters and you have the most messed up family you could imagine. Sin just escalates and gets worse and gets worse and gets worse. And that's just kind of what happens. That generation after generation, we get further and further, and again, still the same God that loved us into being, that loved us into creation. We should be running to him, the only one that can heal us, and we're terrified of him. The one that wants to save us, that wants to make us new and make things right, and we run far from him. And it's interesting that across cultures, across religions, all of humanity realizes something is wrong in the world and we've got to do something to fix it. All of humanity across religions and cultures and countries and time periods realizes that we have done something wrong and there's something broken in our humanity. And that if there is a God, then he must be a perfect God. And if he's a perfect God that we've offended, he deserves a perfect apology, a perfect sacrifice. And so people just keep trying to add on with more sacrifices. And they sacrifice people eventually, thinking, well, there's got to be a more pure, more perfect, more sacred gift that we can give because things are still wrong. And they're terrified of God, the same one that could be their healer. The one that they should be running to, they run from. And if I'm honest, so many times when I've sinned, when I've turned away from God, he's the last person I want to face. He's the last person I want to deal with. The one person that can fix what's wrong, the one person that can bring healing, and I'm terrified of him. So God promises that he's going to send a solution. He's going to send a redeemer, a savior, because we didn't just need helping, right? We just didn't need a hand up. We didn't just need a Band-Aid. We didn't just need a new mentor. We needed someone to rescue us from the sin that led to death. We needed a rescuer, a savior. We talked last night about God being like the good shepherd and us being like sheep. But what happens when a sheep runs so far away that he can't possibly get out? So what does the shepherd do? So God's going to send his own son. He's going to send Jesus. Jesus who's fully God and fully man. But it's interesting because there's this thing that happens when people have been living in oppression for so long. We had become slaves to sin. We had become so used to settling for less than we deserve, for less than we were made for. There's this interesting thing that happens to prisoners when they've been in prison for a long time. They start believing in the lies that they are fed by their captors. There have been plenty of documented stories where people in prisoner of war camps who have been so tortured and brainwashed by their captors that when their rescuers come, they think the rescuer is the bad guy. And they've sympathized with their captors. Because when you lie enough to someone, they start believing it. And so Jesus comes to rescue us, to save us. But God knew that we had been so afraid of him that he couldn't show up in his glory because we were terrified of him. He knew that if he showed up in his glory and his majesty, instead of running to him, we would run from him. And so this is what the prophet Isaiah says is going to happen. 1,000 years before Jesus comes, God tells him to speak this word. And this is going to come true in Jesus. He grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of the dry ground. He had no form or comeliness that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. We esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. So Jesus is going to come, this rescue, this plan from the Father is going to come. The shepherd is going to send someone. He's going to send his only son to rescue the lost sheep, and that's us. But he has to come in disguise. When we see images of Jesus, I think it's so often that we see him as being so beautiful that it's just ridiculous. Like this perfect looking man shows up who looks just like us. You know, there's like a really white guy shows up in the Middle East and he's like, I'm one of you. And you're like, yeah, right. Aren't you in the sun like us? Why aren't you either tan or sunburned? But no, you're pasty white. Our images of Jesus, I think, help us to realize that he was one of us, but often they're not all that accurate. The prophet Isaiah says that when Jesus was going to appear, when the Messiah, the rescuer, was going to come, he was going to look so ordinary that no one would believe it was actually God. So God dwells among us. And he knows that to break us out of our prisons, of our hurts, of our shame, he's going to have to come in disguise to win us back, to rescue us. Because God knows if he shows up looking like God, we would run from him. So there's this thing called the Shroud of Turin, which we would traditionally hold that it could be the burial cloth of Jesus. And they've looked at just the amazing way that kind of the oil and the blood from the person buried in this cloth, they were able to do a 3D kind of drawing of what the person's face would have looked like. And we don't know that this is actually Jesus. But this gives us a pretty good idea of what he would have looked like. And I would just want to show that image, and we'll just keep it up for a little bit. I remember being shocked when I saw that. I mean, it's really not the most attractive face in the world. And I remember feeling bad for thinking that. I'm like, oh, I can't think that about God. But I mean, it's wild to think that God, the perfect God, the God who created the universe just by breathing it, the God who created the most beautiful sunset just by thinking it with no sweat at all, that when he becomes human, this is what he looks like. We're going to talk a little bit about what Jesus went through for us, because I think it's really important. There was this question that someone asked Pope Benedict several years ago. And the person wasn't a Christian who was asking him, and he said, why did Jesus come? What did Jesus actually bring to the world? He claimed to bring an end to poverty, and yet there's still poverty. He claimed to conquer death, and there's still death. What did he actually bring? Pope Benedict said, Jesus brought God. Very simply, Jesus brought God. So the perfect God deserves the perfect sacrifice. We as humans had broken our relationship with him. And it had to be us who restored that relationship, because we were the ones that had turned from him. So he sends his son. Because he's fully God, Jesus is perfect. And because he's fully human, he can give himself as a sacrifice. So I just want to talk about what he went through, because, I mean, the wild thing to me is that he didn't have to do any of it. He could have found a different way to save us, a different way to rescue us, but for whatever reason, Jesus goes through all of this because he is about bringing God to wherever we are, and to the lowest point of humanity, God is there. We don't have a God who looks at us from afar or watches us from a distance. The night before he suffered, Jesus has dinner with his friends. He has this Last Supper with his disciples. And it's interesting because he starts the meal and he kneels down and washes their feet, knowing full well that these feet are going to run from him, that these feet are going to go and betray him. These feet are going to deny him. These feet are going to hide when he needs their presence the most. And still he washes them. And Jesus prays in the garden that night. And as he's praying, he's not just praying because he's afraid of what's going to happen. He's also seeing in his mind who he will suffer for. He sees victims of horrible crimes and the brokenness of horrible criminals. He sees the martyrs that we've heard of and the martyrs that we'll never hear about. He sees people who live great lives and those who live unknown, hidden lives. He sees those who suffer physically and those who suffer emotionally. He saw all of what we would go through. And he didn't have to go through it, but he knew that we would go through it. And he wanted to bring God to wherever we were. So he sweat drops of blood. Scientists say that it's this thing that happens in very rare occasions when someone is under so much pressure and under so much stress that their blood vessels on the surface of the skin actually burst, and it looks like they're sweating blood. And Jesus saw all that he would endure and all that we would endure, and he chose to go through it. And then Judas met them that night and greets him with a kiss. And Jesus didn't have to go through betrayal, but he knew that you would go through betrayal. And he knew that people would turn their back on you. And people who claim to be your friends or claim to love you would hurt you. And he went through it because he knew that's where you would be. And then Jesus that night goes back and forth to different trials. And I got to go to the Holy Land a couple years ago, and we got to see where Pilate was and where the high priests were. But the thing for me that was the most profound was we got to go in this like dungeon. Jesus spent a few hours just kind of imprisoned in this cell, this like holding area in utter darkness. And he didn't have to go through that. He didn't have to deal with it because he's fully God, and he knew he was fully God. At any point, he could have just said, poof, I started it, and poof, I'm ending it. I'll just start over. I'll create new people. I'll create a new earth. But he knew that you couldn't end your suffering. He knew that you would feel alone in darkness. That you would feel and you would experience the pits of suffering. And I know that you're a teenager and people tell you, oh, you know, your life's not that serious. But I know that you've been to the pits, some of you. And I want you to know Jesus has been there too. But he didn't have to, but he knew you would be there. And so there was no place on earth he would rather be than beside you. And then after the trial, they scourged Jesus. And you can kind of see in this image an idea of what it is, just what he went through. And I won't tell you all the details, but just know that it was more than a whip. And his body, and they would hold his arms up so that he couldn't defend himself, so that his back is fully exposed. It's just tearing chunks of skin. And he didn't have to go through with it. But he knew that many of you would suffer in your bodies. Whether it's sickness, whether the way that other people look at you, whether it's a hatred of your body, whether it's the fear that other people just like you for your body. He knew that we would go through that. And so he chose to endure that. I mean, I just think of how wild it is, how these, we may imagine these power-hungry soldiers thinking they're showing him who's boss, and he's thinking, I created you. I remember when this soldier was 3 years old and cried themselves to sleep at night. I've seen them at their worst, and this guy thinks he has power, but Jesus goes through it. He doesn't speak up. He doesn't defend himself. And then Pilate's not sure what to do, and he has a feeling like he shouldn't execute this guy, so he keeps trying to push it off on other people, and so he asks the crowd, what shall I do with Jesus? And they shout out, crucify him, crucify him. And if I was Jesus, this is definitely one of those points where I'd just say, stop, time out, we're ending it. This is it. I gave you chance after chance after chance, looking out in the crowd saying, I healed you, I heard your prayer, I comforted you, I raised a family member from the dead, I fed your whole family, I loved you into being, I was there for every single time you cried, and I've given you just one choice, and you want me killed. But he chose to endure because he knew that the crowd would turn on you. He knew that you would feel like you were put in front of people and judged and mocked and condemned, that your reputation would be executed. And he chose to go through it. And then he carried his cross. And he falls 3 times. I mean, just what a crazy thought that the God of the universe falls. And he didn't have to. But he chose to endure it because he knew that you would fall under the weight of whatever you're going through. And then he was crucified. They nailed him to a cross. And on every image we see They put a loincloth there, but that was not the case, because part of the deal with crucifixion was that you're utterly humiliated. This is to be a sign for everyone. Don't mess with the Roman Empire, or you will suffer utter humiliation and abuse. No matter what you have gone through, Jesus has been there. No matter how low your life has gone, he's been there. But he wasn't alone. On either side of him were these criminals. These criminals who were busted, right? Their arms are stretched out, unable to cover themselves, completely naked, not just physically naked, but also just kind of their crime is written above their head on a plaque so that people can walk by and think, that's what that guy did, he deserves to die. These guys were busted. And I always wondered why they call the day Good Friday, because I'm thinking nothing good happened that day. But I'm sure there's one person who on that day thought, this is the best Friday of my life, and we call him the good criminal. Because he was guilty as charged and deserving of death, and he's hanging there about to die, and who does he find next to him, looking just like him, in the same position, in the same shame, in the same humiliation, suffering the same abuse, and the same execution? He finds God next to him. And Jesus says, today you'll be with me in paradise. We don't know about that criminal's life. We don't know about anything leading up to that moment. We know he definitely did bad stuff, right? But all we know is that with his dying breath, he said, Jesus, remember me. And Jesus said, today you're going to be with me in paradise. And for that good criminal, that was a great Friday. Imagine at your worst, at your lowest, finding God next to you, looking just like you. The cross is proof of how far the shepherd will go to save us, the lost sheep.